Most people ask whether a world without World War II would have been more peaceful. But that is not the real question. Without the war, the dollar may not dominate global trade. The internet may arrive decades later. The Soviet Union may never control Eastern Europe. Colonial empires may last much longer. And the nuclear age may not begin in 1945. So the real question is, if World War II never happened, would the modern world still exist in the form we know? To figure this out, we're going to use a framework called Counterfactual systems analysis. It sounds complex, but we're basically separating this into two clear layers. Layer 1 covers the documented outcomes, what the war actually accelerated, reshaped, or reorganized. And Layer 2, that looks at plausible projections, how those global systems may have developed if the war had never taken place. Section 1. The geopolitical architecture, a forced system reset. Okay, let's dive into this. Before 1939, Europe was the center of the world. It had the strongest industrial economies and the largest empires. The war severely devastated that infrastructure, but that destruction acted as a massive system reset. The sheer scale of it, paradoxically, accelerated modernization. Old factories and entrenched imperial structures were basically wiped out. In their place, initiatives like the Marshall Plan injected $13 billion, roughly $150 billion today, into rebuilding Western Europe. That capital replaced outdated pre-war structures with modern industrial equipment. It also catalyzed the European coal and steel community, which eventually became the European Union, an organization built primarily to avoid another continental war through economic integration. So if you look at the slide, let's systematically compare the historical reality to our plausible projection. In Layer 1, the destruction of European capacity meant that by 1945, the United States was producing roughly 50% of the world's GDP. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's march to Berlin led to the occupation of Eastern Europe, creating a massive buffer zone. But now look at Layer 2. The plausible projection without the war shows a much slower-growing, multipolar globe. Europe likely stays wealthier, looking on the surface, but keeps its older, slower industrial and political structures. And Soviet territorial expansion is severely delayed or possibly halted altogether. Section 2. The global financial system, anchoring the world economy. Now we have to look at how the physical realities of the war reshaped the flow of money. While Europe and Asia lost enormous industrial capacity, American factories were running at maximum output, totally untouched by the physical devastation of the conflict. Because of this massive disparity, delegates from 44 allied nations met in 1944 to establish the Bretton Woods system. This was a critical wartime institutional decision that structurally anchored the global economy directly to the United States. It required participating nations to tie their exchange rates to the US dollar, which at the time was convertible to gold. And this brings us to a really fascinating Layer 2 projection. In our documented history, Layer 1, Bretton Woods elevated the US dollar to the global reserve currency, essentially bankrolling a new Pax Americana. But in a world without the war, dollar dominance likely develops much more slowly. We would probably see a more competitive, multi-currency system where the British pound sterling and competing European currencies retain a much stronger, longer-lasting global role. Section 3, Decolonization and Empire, the Exhaustion Catalyst. To understand this demographic shift, we have to recognize that in 1939, approximately 500 million people lived under European colonial rule, with no immediate dissolution in sight. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we can quantify that collapse. The war forced Britain to spend enormous resources defending its empire, while France and the Netherlands were physically occupied. The conflict materially and politically exhausted these powers. They simply no longer possessed the military or economic capacity to suppress the increasingly organized independence movements that were rising in their territories. Tracing this timeline, you can visually see how World War II acted as an intense catalyst. It severely compressed the timeline of global decolonization. India and Pakistan achieved independence by 1947, followed swiftly by others like Indonesia in 1949. But if we look at our Layer 2 plausible projection, it suggests that without the sheer exhaustion caused by the war, European colonial rule may have persisted a lot longer, potentially delaying these independence timelines well into the 1970s or beyond. Section 4. Accelerating modern technology, destruction as accelerator. Beyond borders and economies, military urgency drove research and invention at a pace that peacetime markets simply would not have matched. If you point your attention to the slide, the massive leap from early discoveries to forced mass production is pretty stark. Take penicillin. It was discovered in 1928, but it wasn't until 1943 that wartime necessity forced its mass production to treat infected soldiers. Similarly, the urgent need to break codes and calculate ballistics led to ENIAC in 1945, the very first electronic general-purpose computer. Without this immense pressure, our plausible projection places mass antibiotic production and advanced computing decades later. This technological acceleration directly shaped our modern communication structures. In Layer 1, the reality is that the United States Department of Defense funded ARPANET in the late 1960s, a direct result of post-war military-industrial research networks. Compare that to Layer 2. Without that specific military urgency and massive defense budget backing it, the foundational infrastructure for the internet arrives on a much, much slower timeline.
Section 5. The nuclear age, the weapon that may have ended large wars. We're going to shift now to the Manhattan Project, the $2 billion wartime effort that birthed the nuclear age.
The development of these weapons introduced the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. It presents a highly uncomfortable paradox. The most destructive weapon ever built, possessing the power to wipe out civilization, may have effectively prevented a third world war between superpowers by making the cost of direct conflict unsurvivable for both sides. We have to present this systems analysis carefully. In Layer 1, nuclear deterrence defined the entirety of the Cold War. But look at Layer 2. If nuclear weapons were delayed because there was no Manhattan Project, a world without nuclear weapons is not automatically more peaceful. It's just one plausible path where, absent the terrifying reality of mutually assured destruction, large conventional wars between major powers remain highly possible. Section 6. The Modern Mirror, a world built on 1945. Let's move to and see how this builds into the architecture of the modern world we see today. Walking through these points, the systems shaped in 1945 deeply influence our current reality. The geopolitical fault lines between Russia and Western institutions stem directly from the borders drawn at Yalta and Potsdam. The US dollar maintains global dominance via Bretton Woods. The digital world scale relies heavily on defense budgets scaled up during the Cold War. And the European Union exists as an institutional response to the trauma of continental devastation. So the crucial point is summarized right here. World War II was not simply a catastrophe. It was a forced system reset. The old structures were replaced at an enormous and terrible cost with new ones. Without the war, the world would likely be older in its structures, more colonial in its governance, slower in its technology, and more distributed in its power, even if millions more were alive. Which leaves us with one final thought. The 20th century left a massive, unalterable structural footprint on every system we rely on today. So, looking at the global architecture of finance, technology, and geopolitics, could the modern world have been built any other way?